Okay, great. So I want to first of all just say thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I wish I could have been here in person, but this will have to do. I'm going to give some comments focusing particularly on the paper which I read, Investing in Nature Can Improve Equity and Economic Returns. And so I want to start with just a summary of what I got out of the paper. First of all, as we heard about, this is a very impressive global analysis of investments in ecosystem services that combined a global trade model together with the kind of spatially specific granular invest model. It looked at a number of scenarios, including removing agricultural subsidies and redirecting those funds in various ways, payments for ecosystem services programs, and then combining some of these policies. The new services that make it into the model now are crop pollination, timber from forests, food from marine fisheries, and carbon sequestration. And so the key results that come out of this is, first of all, a finding that including ecosystem services lowers baseline GDP, especially in low-income countries. So if you kind of just leave ecosystem services out of your model, you're really missing something because when you just include them under BAU conditions, the global GDP will go down. Fortunately, all five policies offset this. So all five policies raise global GDP relative to that baseline with gross effects in the range of 100 to 200 billion. The biggest effect coming from this policy that redirects ag subsidies into R&D for agriculture, but the combined policy has the largest net benefit when carbon is included, and that's at 325 billion. Okay, so that's a quick summary of the paper. I want to start at like a really high level, kind of the 30,000-foot view, and ask sort of what's the main point, not to like suggest there isn't a point. Really what I want to say is I think that different audiences will get different things out of this paper. If this paper was published in a general science journal, PNAS, and I think a general audience will get the following message, the following takeaway, which I'll just quote from the paper. We show that investments in nature result in large improvements relative to a business as usual path. I think an economics audience is going to get a slightly different message. I think that we already know the direction of the effect. If you've got a bunch of goods that are not being priced, and then you price them, it's got to basically make, unless you do that in a really inefficient way, it's got to make things better off relative to not pricing them. And so that effect should be positive, but we don't know what the magnitude of it will be in terms of GDP and welfare changes. And so I think that's what we're really interested in as economists. And then I think the policy audience is going to ask, what's really in it for us? What are the gains or losses to a given jurisdiction, such as a country, if they support this sort of coordinated global investment policy to increase ecosystem services around the world? And so I'm going to come back particularly to these 2 points that I mentioned here, the magnitudes and also the policy audience, policy questions. Before I do that, though, I want to just for a moment, just sort of highlight just what an incredible achievement this paper is. And you already know that from listening to Steve and to Justin. But I think it's interesting if we, as I was preparing these remarks, I went back and looked at a paper that was published just 15 years ago, also in PNAS. And these authors were simply trying to map ecosystem services at a global scale, just map them, not do anything else with them. And they concluded that using available data of global extent, we find only 4 ecosystem services for which we could map proxies at a global scale, and even those data are imperfect. And so just 15 years later, we're not only mapping a whole bunch of these services, we're also endogenizing them in a global trade model. So really amazing, like the advances that we've been able to achieve thanks to the great work of Justin and Steve to get us to the point where we are. I think, makes lots of advances on a number of different margins, and I'll just leave it. I'll just leave it at that to talk about other things. Justin actually went over this example. I was going to highlight sort of how pollination services get brought into the model, but I think we heard something about that already, so I'll skip over that. And I'll get to the question about magnitudes, which I think is what economists would be most interested in. And if I have one sort of bone to pick with the paper, I think it's that they kind of oversell the magnitudes. And so my point is this, that under BAU, we find that if you include ecosystem services, GDP in 2030 goes down by about $75 billion. So that's the model with ecosystem services compared to the model without ecosystem services. BAU goes down by this amount. The policies produce net gains in the on the order of $100 to $200 billion per year. And in various places, these changes are referred to as large. So, for example, we find that policies that increase investment in nature can generate large increases in GDP relative to BAU. Like, to me, $100 billion is an awful lot of money, but I think the right comparison here really should be to global GDP, not to like my own wealth. And so currently global GDP is about $100 trillion. So these changes are really small, right? Compared to that benchmark, they're, 0.1 to 0.2% of a change. And so I'm not at all suggesting like ecosystem services don't matter or we shouldn't be trying to model them. I think we should. But I don't think like the evidence from that particular exercise leads me to be convinced that these are really huge differences. I expect as the work progresses and more services are brought into the model, that will very, very likely change. Okay. I was a little bit, so one of the things the model can do is to measure GDP, but also to measure welfare and specifically equivalent variation. And if I'm reading it right, it seems like those measures really are different in this framework. And so here, the graph on the right, which we saw before, is a percentage change, again, in that baseline from including ecosystem services, here, though, measured as equivalent variation. And so we get about an 8% decline globally in equivalent variation when you include ecosystem services in the BAU. So if I'm doing the math right, that's an 8% change, which is about 2 orders of magnitude larger than the GDP change. And I'm just wondering, like, why is it that those two different measures, which I realize they're different things, but I was really surprised to see that they diverged so much. So that was one of the questions I had. I also had a question about fisheries. I recently wrote a paper about global fisheries, and where we're asking some of the same kinds of questions and assembled probably a lot of the same data. They have in their baseline really, fisheries declining around the world, and I was curious about what was really driving that trend. If you look at recent data, for the last several decades, you see actually that the harvests from global fisheries have been pretty stable for a number of decades, and if you include aquaculture, they're going up over time. U.S. fisheries have been relatively stable, and that's where we see some of the really big declines in the GTAP Invest version. So it just caught my eye that this seems something that kind of went against what I would have expected. Okay. I want to then conclude with just some comments on future work. Of course, there's always other things you can add to any other model. I'm sure the authors have their own list of things. We heard about some of them, additional services. Climate's an obvious one, like could climate be endogenous in this model too? That seems like a logical next place to go. I also wondered a bit about property rights. When we think about ecosystem services from land, we should really think about, what are are there good property rights? Are there secure property rights, well-defined property rights? And the fact is that around the world, there's a lot of cases where that isn't true. And if you then provide incentives for increasing ecosystem services, that's going to work if you've got good property rights. And I'm not sure I think that GTAP assumes sort of perfect property rights, if I'm not mistaken. But that's not really the reality. And so that might be a margin. I think that's particularly important given the focus on land-based ecosystem services. Another question I had is, what's the return on investment? So we see that if you take a bunch of money from one part of the economy and you kind of move it somewhere else and you put it into ecosystem services, you get these gains in GDP. But is there any sort of return on investment measure so we could have a sense of, well, was that the best thing you could have done with that money, or could you have done something else maybe that had a bigger return? I wasn't sure if that's something that could be brought into this framework. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the policies. So by and large, what the analysis looked at were coordinated global policies. So for example, global payments for ecosystem services. And this is, I'm channeling here my colleague Gary Leibkap. He would have said this: if coordinated policies produce net gains, why isn't it being done, right? So in other words, what's the obstacle to their adoption? Is it that actually countries don't really care about equivalent variation, or are there huge transactions costs that stand in the way of adoption? I think another way to put it is, what features in your model are not in your model that maybe should be, that would explain kind of the lack of adoption, right? So maybe you do need costs in there of various kinds that in order to more realistically represent these policies. I think if we move to the unilateral policies, some really interesting questions that we could be asking. If we look around the world, there are payments for ecosystem services programs already. Okay, so like this article by Salzman and all, many of you probably know, documents, a lot of money going into PES already. So I was curious to understand if your model could explain that. So why is it that some countries are already acting unilaterally? And I think a model that integrates ecosystem services with trade and the global economy is really a powerful tool for answering those kinds of questions about these sort of positive questions about who benefits really from investing in ecosystem services. And then I think a more normative question is, should countries pursue kind of unilateral policies? Should the country of Chile, for example, be investing in ecosystem services if they're the only ones doing it? And so I think this model could be really useful to policymakers to try to sort of answer those kinds of critical questions. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Plantinga. So now we have time for a few questions from the audience. Yes, over there.
Hi, all. First of all, thank you for a great presentation and all the effort you're putting with this project. I wonder, when you showed us the countries that the poor countries were affected the most, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the mechanisms behind that, because if you think all the policies were the ones you talked about were more like global policies that could be implemented, but knowing a little bit about the mechanisms in smaller regions could tell us a little bit about what are the local policies that could be implemented, which is also was kind of briefly just mentioned in the discussion of the paper. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, I have one question myself. Yes, so we talked about this during lunch a little bit, but I was wondering about the intertemporal aspect of the model. So you mentioned at a certain point that you had myopic expectations, and I was wondering how that influences the results that you're getting, because I believe that many of the effects may come through anticipation. This is also related to Luigi's presentation, for example, that if you foresee that there's a tipping point in some of the ecosystem services that you are evaluating, you may react beforehand and you may change your behavior. So I was wondering if you introduce this in a certain way in your modeling, and if not, how that would change your analysis. And yes. You can.
Should I start in on answers? Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for these excellent questions. Maybe I'll start with Andrew's discussant questions first. And I'll start with the big one about the magnitudes. Are those big numbers? And compared to my income, also 100 million is a big number, but I totally agree that relative to global GDP, this is a very small number. So you're right to pick out on that. Just some of the internal thinking that we had as a team is we got that criticism early and often, and actually maybe the history of it can even explain it more, is the first project that funded this was from the World Wildlife Fund, and they were setting out to answer the question of how valuable is all of nature to all of the economy. And that question has been asked before, and we get implausibly large and or small numbers depending on if we compare it to infinity or the current GDP. But either way, what was unique about this WWF study is they commissioned economists to ask, how would you answer this in a more defensible way than just adding up infinities or something like that? And so we thought this would be a good project. Our first numbers were too small. They were expecting the numbers to be closer to the Costanza types of numbers of 44 trillion or something like that, and those certainly are bigger. But what I would want to say is the reason ours are small, and we completely recognize that they are, and so I actually really like your point about the overselling. That's maybe the part that we could have changed the most. But just in terms of contextualizing these, it's that point again. We were looking at such a small subset of ecosystem services, intending to be conservative in our choices everywhere along the way, and I think we are systematically undervaluing it. But there's also deeper reasons, is we're only looking at things that we can observe behavior on the margin. A Costanza type of number is looking at a total value, and those are interesting and certainly bigger numbers, but we really were limiting to where do we have evidence on elasticities and how markets respond. And so that automatically puts us in the lower numbers. So there's a lot more I could say on that. I think it's a very good point, and that probably is the single biggest thing I would have changed in the paper, just how we express that number. But in terms of the way I would express it in a positive sense is, we are finding that this is a way to start making progress on that type of calculation. And I think, as you point out, as we include more ecosystem services or strengthen our evidence base on what those linkages are, we will expect those numbers to get larger. But just the final point on the size question, when we were talking about this with the members of the GTAP community, they were saying, we got similar types of responses to some of our original work that was asking what would the total value be of total free trade implementation, so get rid of all the trade restrictions in the world. And that was only a little bit bigger than the numbers we found. And so I think this is also just reflecting the very conservative estimate of computable general equilibrium modeling overall. And so really, I would say the answer is a shout out to our previous discussions about what about tipping points, what about other things. So that was maybe more on that point than I should have gone into. Although still one last point is a slide I skipped. We did do one potentially interesting sensitivity analysis that instead of looking at marginal changes in ecosystem services as induced by endogenous land use change, we said, well, let's just try to say what would happen if we had ecosystem collapse. So forget about our endogenous land use change, just implement really big shocks. And so we looked at the Amazon converting, as is worried, from its forest state to a much drier state of shrublands, et cetera. We also looked at marine fisheries collapses and pollination collapse, all of which have been worried about. And there we not surprisingly found the bigger numbers. It was 2.7 trillion instead of the 75 billion. And so a lot of the smallness of the number simply comes from the fact that we were looking at pretty small changes around the margin, and we're really more interested in directionality. A few other questions that stood out. Just a clarification on the equivalent variation, the welfare versus GDP. They were different, and it was by about a factor of 2. So I think some units got crossed there. But what it was that was causing this difference is equivalent variation accounts for the transfers between countries, for instance, and among many other things. It's a broader set of metrics. And so because we had a global payments for ecosystem services scheme, that was actually a large amount of money being transferred from rich countries to poor countries, and that does show up in equivalent variation, but doesn't show up in GDP. You're not producing that transfer. There's more to that, but we sort of had an internal debate, and we kind of wanted to talk about it in both terms. More people understand GDP. It's a splashier figure, but equivalent variation we thought was the better metric in terms of being robust. There's a lot more there, but we only have 3 minutes left, so I'll just mention a few other. One more one is on fisheries. It's a very good point. There, a lot of the results were driven by the model results from previously calculated model intercomparison projects. So we relied on FishMIP. We've actually been fortunate enough with this most recent engagement with the World Bank. We've employed William Chung over at UCSB and to use his advanced fishing models. And so I think we'll have a lot more insight on that point. So I'd stay tuned on that one. But for the time being, our effects were mostly driven by how does climate change cause fish populations to move? And in some cases, it was positive because it caused large populations to migrate into new areas that were then subsequently fished. To the audience questions then, so what are the mechanisms behind why our policies and also the impact of nature overall mattered most for low-income countries? I think there's a variety of different pathways. The one I thought was the clearest was for pollination. Number one, they produced, at least as a percentage of their agricultural product, things that were dependent on pollination more. Moreover, they had a very heterogeneous landscape where there was a high mixing of wild pollinator habitat with pollination-dependent crops, and we're measuring that spatial heterogeneity. In the U.S., essentially you can't lose that much from pollination because we've already lost most of it. We have huge tracts. That's not quite true from natural habitat. Still lots of dollars are put in towards adding hedgerows or even artificial sources. But what we were looking at was a reduction in wild pollinator habitat, and that is just much more tightly intermingled with the pollinator-dependent crops in the lower-income countries. So that's just one example. I think it's indicative of a broader thing, though, is that low-income countries are more reliant on nature, so that the pollination would be one example, but also just on common and public resources. So that would be another mechanism, is these policies were aimed at protecting things that were largely common goods. And so where those countries rely more on common goods, these policies would be more effective. So I think that's kind of a general take on the mechanisms. I think more work on specific pathways is definitely needed. And then the final question on the intertemporal aspect of this. Indeed, the CGE that we used assumes myopic agents, and the short answer is we come from the CGE world where they have lots of sectors but simplified representations of time, and so that's mostly there just so that we can have those lots of sectors and still be able to solve it. But as soon as this report came out, the first one, we did start engaging with people who were interested in those questions because they're very important. Tipping point ones are all fundamentally time-based. And so that's why I spent a good portion of my slides adding new content that wasn't in the paper on our switch over to recursive dynamic. That's still not fully forward-looking, and so I think there's yet another step to go there. But what I would say is this is a blank slate, a research agenda that has a lot of potential areas to make progress. We sort of handled the cross-sectional sectoral one with the most detail because we were really interested in who are the winners and losers. But I think additional analyses could get at that question of what happens when you have different expectation formation processes and non-myopic agents. So a very great point. But thank you.